Welcome back to Social Psychology. I'm your professor, Ryan Keith. Welcome back to Social Psychology. I'm your professor, Ryan Keith. And in this video, I want to talk to you about something that you likely heard about in general psychology, in popular culture and popular media, and you've definitely read about already in this class. That's the cases of bystander non-intervention, of the bystander effect, and individuals like Kitty Genovese. We've heard a lot that there's safety in numbers, but if you've heard about the cases of bystander non-intervention, you know that that's not the case. Whether we're talking about the Good Samaritan study or case studies like Kitty Genovese or Delitha Ward, we know that in fact there isn't safety in numbers, there's danger in numbers. That the more people are around, the less likely individuals are to help in times of crisis. In the case of Kitty Genovese, this is the most commonly discussed case study of bystander non-intervention in the history of psychology. And the way the story goes is that a young woman was attacked outside, in the 1970s, a young woman was attacked right outside her New York City apartment building, and that ultimately the man who attacked her did so with a knife, and didn't just attack her once, but attacked her 4 separate times over the course of 45 minutes, stabbing her and leaving, and then returning and stabbing her and leaving and returning and coming back again. That over the course of close to an hour, before the police officers were able to arrive on scene, her neighbors turned on their lights, opened their windows, looked outside, and ultimately went back to their business. In our discussion of altruism, of prosocial behavior, of how we're willing to help each other out, I want to talk about what happens when altruism fails, why it is we don't always help each other out, and what the reasons are why in these times of crises we fail to do what most of us imagine we would do when we play out some sort of fantasy hero situation in our heads. But the first thing I need to do is clear a little something up. Evidence seems to suggest that this case didn't really happen the way that we think it did. That in fact, the most famous case of bystander non-intervention is not a case of bystander non-intervention at all. That not only did her neighbors turn on their lights and look out the windows, but they called the New York City Police Department. They called 911 repeatedly and asked for police to arrive on scene. Because of issues with the NYPD, it took them close to an hour to arrive, and the best explanation for what happened here is that in fact it goes all the way up to the New York City Chief of Police. When asked by reporters what happened, he said that they simply never received a call. And then reporter after reporter carried this story of supposed good people turned bad people being too lazy to help each other out until this made its way into psychology textbooks as pure social psychology gold. Apart from this individual case, however, there are many cases of true bystander non-intervention, whether it's people drowning just offshore or in the case of somebody like Delitha Ward. Delitha Ward, a woman of color, was involved in a fender bender in the 1990s in Texas. She rear-ended a pickup truck. After this occurred, 4 men climbed out of the pickup truck. They dragged her from their car. They beat her while more than 40 cars drove by. They beat her while she tried to scramble away. Nobody stopped. Bystanders did watch from either end of the bridge. Eventually, she escaped, climbed over the railing, and plummeted into the water below where she drowned to death. Finally, a couple of observers swam to go save Miss Ward, but by the time they pulled her out, she had died. There are many cases of people not stopping to help. Again, the Good Samaritan study by Darley and Batson demonstrate that the more time people have, the more likely to help. But in the end, 2/3 of people simply will not stop and help someone who's in need. So why is this? Are we not as helpful as we imagine we are? Many people imagine that the reason we don't stop and help is that deep down inside we're cowardly. We're afraid to help. Either we're afraid that the person who's attacking the victim will turn and attack us, or we're afraid that if we try and help somebody, it'll go wrong and ultimately we'll be left to blame. This is partly true. But in the end, what we see is that the reason people don't stop and help is simply because of what's called psychological paralysis. That same paralysis you feel, that indecision paralysis, when you don't know if you should go and get Mexican food or Chinese food. You don't know if you should watch The Witcher or Tiger King. You don't know if you should help or not. But in a time of crisis, why shouldn't you help? Well, there are a couple of explanations for this, but the biggest reason why we end up in this situation of decision paralysis or psychological paralysis is that we have a really hard time figuring out exactly what it is that's going on. You guys remember back when we talked about group functioning, we discussed dominant response theory, and that in times of cognitive stress, we fall back on our dominant responses. you know how to drive to work, you know what to do when you get there, you know what to do on your computer when you're playing video games, and you know how to watch TV, you know how to cook dinner. You've had countless experiences with all of these. But a situation, luckily, most of us have never been in, is dealing with somebody who has a handgun, or somebody who has a knife, or helping somebody who's drowning, or dealing with someone who is somebody who is choking. One of the biggest reasons that you see CPR classes across the country is so that we know what to do when somebody is asphyxiating, unable to breathe, or they've collapsed. Because in a situation that we've never dealt with and we have no idea how, even if we've played out a fantasy in our minds, we freeze. The first thing we need to go through in a situation like that is to appraise it and figure out what in the hell is even going on. You're walking by a playground and you hear children screaming. Now, there are a couple of reasons why children scream. The first is that they're currently being murdered. But most of the time that you've walked past a playground, children are not currently being murdered. What are they doing? They're playing. And a lot of times when children are playing, they're screaming. So you've had countless experiences with children screaming because they're playing, but never because they've been murdered. You look at the playground, you see an adult dragging a screaming kid away. Well, what does that mean? It could mean murder, but probably not. Probably it's just a parent. So even when all signs point to an emergency situation happening, because it's so unfamiliar, we look for a way to assimilate, using this terminology from the beginning of the semester, to assimilate this experience into our existing frameworks, our schemas. It's really hard to accommodate an unfamiliar experience, so we don't. We assume that maybe it's a parent dragging the kid away. We assume that the person in the pool is just playing around. We assume that maybe the person being stabbed isn't really being stabbed, that they're roughhousing or something. Another reason why we have a hard time understanding what's going on is that we suffer from something called pluralistic ignorance. Pluralistic ignorance means that we assume that everybody else around us knows something that we don't. Much like the imposter effect or imposter bias that leads us to assume that every other silent student in the classroom knows something we don't, and they're sitting there silently, confidently going through the course. We assume that everyone else around us knows what's going on in this situation. The reason nobody else is helping the person who's drowning at the beach is that it's not really an emergency. If it were an emergency, someone would be helping. The problem with this pluralistic ignorance is that everybody else is assuming exactly the same thing. Even if it were a situation in which you can conclude it's an emergency, in many emergency situations we end up freezing. We don't really know what to do. And if we act irrationally, because that's what our brain does when we're panicking. When we panic, we experience this sharpening of cognition, where all unnecessary cognitive processes fall by the wayside. Our ability to think critically and to think carefully about what's happening to solve problems goes away. We get focused on a threat and an exit, how to get away from the threat and how to get toward the exit. Or, if we're going to stop the threat, to do it in the most basic way possible. There are anecdotal stories of parents who intervene with dangerous gunmen and succeed, or people who talk down terrorists successfully and everyone survives. But for every example of one of those cases, there are numerous examples of people who bungle the situation and simply make it worse. For example, my father, as long as I grew up, was a gun owner. We had guns in the house, and we loved guns. They were a fun way to pass the time. We shot targets. We went out in the woods and used guns. This is what growing up in rural North Florida is like. And even in his 70s, my father, who lived in subsidized housing, he had this narrative in his head. He kept a .38 pistol underneath his mattress, and he had this story in his head that if somebody broke in, as he knew they would, if someone broke into his door, he had a line of sight from his bedroom, kept the door open, bedroom to the front door, and that he would roll out of bed, and on his way he would grab the pistol, he'd land on his knee in this action pose, he'd line up his shot, and he'd be able to get 3 shots off in the intruder before they even knew what happened. But this assumes that my father, who drank on a regular basis anyway, would be clear-headed enough in the middle of the night to be able to determine not just where he was, but also what was going on, that the noise he heard was in fact an intruder and not someone outside, that it was an intruder and not a family member, that he didn't just imagine something or wake up from a bad dream, and then he'd be able to execute this maneuver in his groggy, potentially inebriated, panicked state that required this athletic precision and eye-hand coordination. And in fact, because of all of the problems that line up there, because when we hear a strange noise downstairs, or we hear odd voices in the middle of the night, because we have such a difficult time categorizing what's going on, we tend to handle these situations poorly. And if we do conclude there's an intruder, not only are our hands shaky, but so are our minds. The result is statistically, when we have a gun in our household, whether it's loaded or not, the person who is most likely to hurt you is you. That when homeowners defend their homes using firearms, statistically, they're more likely to harm themselves or a family member or another resident of the home than they are the intruder. That even though our brainstems tell us we need to look out for ourselves and our family members, act altruistically, and get in the line of fire to save them, when you pull out that gun, you increase, not decrease, the chances that your family are going to get harmed. You end up decreasing that you and your family members will make it through that situation alive. It's tough to balance these things because we know all the way up here in our fancy heads that wielding a gun in your house when it's being invaded is a dangerous prospect, and in the end, statistically makes the situation worse. But way back here, in a much older, much more powerful part of our brains, we also know that we would much prefer the ability to defend ourselves than not. So what does this have to do with the bystander effect? Well, what it means is that when your life is in danger and other people's lives are in danger, right, we want to plan ahead and do things like decrease school shootings by having everybody in the school be armed. This might generally decrease the likelihood of school shootings. I don't know. We don't have data on this. But one thing we do know is that having teachers and principals and SROs and hell, even parents and students armed with firearms is not going to increase the likelihood that everybody gets out of there. It's going to increase the likelihood that we have a bloodbath. Because in this moment, it doesn't matter how well you can punch paper or knock over cans or shoot a Mr. Potato Head toy you got from McDonald's, borrowing from my own experience. It doesn't matter how steady your hand is. What matters is how steady your head is. And in the middle of a panicked situation, how are you going to be able to tell the difference between a dangerous gunman and an allied one? How will you be able to tell when you are so panicked you can't see straight between a dangerous invader who has a gun and a coworker who has a gun? How will you be able to tell the difference between a student who's unarmed and has a cell phone and a student who is armed and wants to hurt everybody else? In the end, falling back on our dominant response means that if you want to prepare yourself to help other people, there are a few things that are really key. The first is to maintain a particular kind of identity and training. The people who are most likely to help others and be competent in that helping are people who have been trained. The people who are likely to effectively stop intruders in their household, to intervene during an armed robbery, or even help in the case of CPR are first responders and combat veterans, people who have been trained specifically how to operate in emergency situations while experiencing panic. It's not that you're cool as a cucumber in a firefight, it's that you know how to operate in that panic. And if you're somebody with a specific kind of training, not only do you know how to operate in that headspace, but you also have at hand specific steps to follow. When we're stressed and we don't have specific steps, we don't deal well with that stress. That's why when your professor tells you that you need to study in order to not fail a class, that can do more harm than good. When you know you need to budget because you can't pay your bills, you avoid budgeting because you're stressed and you don't know how. When you know that your car is likely to break down and you need to get that service, but you also need to get to work, you're not going to go get the service because you don't know the specific steps, you don't know what to do, and you're stressed. So this is the other part, having specific training. One of the classes that we took when getting ready to have our baby was an infant CPR class. I'm fortunate enough at this point to not have had to use that CPR training, but having those specific steps make me more likely to help. You're more likely to help somebody if you've had training in how to help someone and if you have a specific identity. But also, here's my favorite, knowing about the bystander effect. The fact that you are in a social psychology class and you know that people are less likely, not more likely to help others when they're in a group, means that you are now more likely to help people. When you witness a car accident and see cars driving by, you're less likely to say, well, that's someone else's problem. This is someone else's issue, and I don't need to deal with it. So not only did you learn about the bystander effect today, but you also became a better person. If you have questions, I know I talked about a lot of stuff here, but if you have questions about the bystander effect, what causes it and what prevents it, or anything else in this class, of course, talk to me during office hours at officehours.page.link/meet or send me an email. You can also hit me up during the live stream this Friday. Don't forget to post questions to it. Or you can call or text at 352-327-8259. Again, I can't guarantee I'll be able to respond or text back right away, but I'll hit you up as soon as I can. So yeah, that's it. I'm looking forward to talking to you more about how we're wonderful but also horrible people. If you have more questions, let me know. This is still social psychology, and I am still your professor, Ryan Keith.